Welcome to the first installment in our series of panel discussions focused on rethinking risk and resilience and the emergence of the Global Strategic Intelligence function. My name is Kevin Lyman, Director of Global Thought Leadership at Invesco. There are a great many aspects to this topic, and we ought to say from the get-go that we won't be able to cover all of them today. In future episodes, we'll take a much closer look at the variety of interconnected threats and challenges facing companies today. We'll also examine how management teams and boards of directors can engage a global strategic intelligence function to help increase the effectiveness of their corporate risk management. We'll then discuss the steps and some of the potential challenges to building a strong global strategic intelligence function. Finally, we'll examine the tools and technology that are available to companies and how they can be applied in the strategic intelligence function and beyond. For today's discussion, though, we'll focus on providing an overview of this exciting and fast-developing area and address why companies need to be engaging in new thinking today. Each of my guests brings a distinct and informative perspective on developments in this field. Chris Ruggieri is a principal and crisis and resilience leader with Deloitte. Also joining us from Deloitte is Linda Walsh, Managing Director and Cyber Risk Services Data Solution Leader. Marianne Nichols is Invesco's Global Head of Intelligence and Threat Analysis. Finally, Adam Stolberg is Professor and Chair of the Sam Nunn School for International Affairs at Georgia Institute of Technology. Chris, perhaps you could kick us off by talking a little bit about Deloitte's recent work on rebooting risk and what prompted your new approach to strengthening corporate risk management and resilience.
Sure. Thank you, Kevin, and very nice to be with you today. What prompted us is our view that traditional approaches to risk management are inadequate to meet the challenges of the day. And what we often see are risk management programs that tend to be performative in orientation. And what I mean by that is they tend to be exercises that are dutifully repeated rather than strategic practices. And this may work well for known risks in a fairly static environment, but as COVID has demonstrated, the environment we live in is anything but static. And risk management is not just about loss prevention. It's about increasing the probability of achieving your strategic and financial objectives. And we don't think of risk as a well-behaved house guest. It's anything but. And risk is, in most cases, impossible to predict. Yet key stakeholders, most notably customers and investors, will continue to hold management accountable for performance and results even when a risk event is unpredictable and unprecedented like COVID-19 was. So therefore, we believe risk needs to be rebooted. It needs to be more closely aligned with strategy, focusing risk management on what matters most, integrated across the organization and cutting across silos. It needs to be future focused and accountable for delivering a return on your investment in risk management.
And I think we'll talk in a minute about how this new global strategic intelligence function really aids in a lot of those objectives. But before we do that, I want to kind of take it up a level. And Adam, I'm going to come to you and say it feels like the world around us these days, not just the business world, but even at the macro and the geopolitical level, has changed so much in recent years. There's so much volatility and unpredictability everywhere you look. Seems to be growing every day. What do you think is driving these changes?
Well, thank you, Kevin. Thanks for the invitation and also the question. And I think you're indeed correct. The international relations landscape, I think, is indeed in flux. Why is it in flux? Well, I think there have been a number of things that have happened really since the end of the Cold War. One, we've seen the end of an ideological rivalry, the change in the distribution of power from two great superpowers, from a period that then went to where it seemed like it was the American unipolar moment to another era where we now see multiple regional players. But I think what's most interesting to focus on is the character of the change of the landscape. And here, I would say the international landscape is much different than the ones that our parents or even we learned about, where it was a world dominated by states. States were relatively isolated. We're seeing a multidimensional, greater intensity of interdependence that cuts across different policy, economic domains, that puts states in direct contact not only with each other, but non-state actors and companies. And so the metaphor today is not one of states that are atomized or interact in dyadic context. It's more about states interacting in networks. So that's the landscape that brings states in many different ways in their domestic politics as well as their foreign policy, intruding into markets and other types of exchanges. It also brings companies into the national security realm in ways that we hadn't thought about before in terms of their role in securing vital supply lines and supply chains. So we have a very different landscape, as you rightly noted, characterized by networks of interaction and interdependencies that cut across multiple dimensions. So it's a much more complicated and complex landscape where I think the business operations and the issues that hit businesses from cyber to branding and other topics are front and center and impacted directly by this complex set of relationships.
And that's the perfect setup, really, Marianne, for you to talk a little bit about the global strategic intelligence function that you've built at Invesco over recent years in response to all of these changes that Adam's been talking about. Can you talk a little bit about how and why you built the team? And then we'd also love to hear a little bit about how you work with some of the other teams at Invesco, the enterprise risk function, internal audit, and the other functions that support the overall risk management effort at Invesco.
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin. Absolutely. So we built this program about 5 years ago, started out as a cyber threat intelligence function, and then expanded out as cyber crosses everything into other parts of the business. So what we have found over the last couple of years is that our function really does complement enterprise risk. So enterprise risk primarily being responsible for assessing the likelihood and potential impact of strategic business goals and objectives. Our purpose is to be responsible for both tactical and strategic analysis. On the tactical front, we are regularly assessing potential threats and the interconnectedness of those threats. So for example, if there's a cyber vulnerability, we're reaching out to security, technology, others. If we are seeing potential or seeing chatter about a potential protest at one of our offices, then we are going to be reaching out to physical security facilities. But depending on the protest, we may also need to reach out to brand and global comms. So we also have a global intelligence briefing that goes to all employees each day. And in that briefing, we identify threats, potential impact to the business, as well as mitigation strategy. So in the case of a cyber example, what are we doing to mitigate as best we can that vulnerability? Then we move into strategic analysis. So with all the threats that we've identified throughout the year, what are the actual risks of those threats to the business? So how many times, for example, did we see or write about a similar cyber vulnerability? Or do we see a trend in the number of times we have identified a particular protest or a theme of a protest? And so that analysis helps us identify the impact and likelihood of the risk. And that is then, we pull that into our annual assessment, which is then provided to the business to include enterprise risk and others.
So Linda, maybe you could jump in with some additional examples of what you've seen this global strategic intelligence function look like in action.
Thanks, Kevin. And Marianne, you bring up some really good points. I think as we evolve the corporate intelligence landscape, we need to make sure that we're not looking at it in isolation. And you brought up some really good examples of how pulling together those geopolitical things, as well as maybe a ransomware attack, malware trends, are going to help everybody look at this in a more holistic way to reduce the attack surface. I think there's another point to this. And as we try to shift to being more proactive along this security continuum, we want to make sure that we're not just looking at external, and we're also trying to aggregate our information along with internal. Let me use an example. One of the things that we saw during the pandemic was a huge increase of work from home. Organizations had to move quickly to get their employees on laptops at home. they had a lot of different factors going on. Employees that maybe feared their job was at risk. Maybe it was harder to be proactive and productive, I should say. And employees may have been using their personal devices. All of these things spread out the attack surface or the potential attack surface. And I really think that that's a great example of using the corporate intelligence function to kind of bring things back into focus, that rush to be operationalized. And organizations were inclined to maybe downgrade some security features. And as we got everybody remotely working, and we needed to go back and say, did we make a configuration adjustment that was not for the best attack surface reduction? And looking at that to make sure that organizations were not relaxing their risk tolerance for their third-party vendors as well. And all of this information in this constantly changing threat landscape, we are looking at different ways to be proactive with that data and look at baseline security events to see where we can be ahead of things rather than just reacting to them. And as Marianne said, the more intelligence we can bring under one shingle or one roof and look for relationship data in there, the better off we're going to be in securing our systems.
Yes, and COVID has changed so much about the way that the companies interact with the world around them. It's a really interesting point. Adam, I'm going to take it back to you. What have you seen in terms of the impact on relations between states and companies and other actors that the pandemic has had?
Kevin, I would basically say that COVID is both a manifestation and a spotlight of this highly interdependent networked international landscape that I was discussing earlier. It is a reflection in the sense that if you just hark back into the very inception of the pandemic, we saw the interdependence of our critical infrastructure implicated with the importance of shutting down air travel and other forms of communication and interdependencies. In addition, I think COVID highlighted the importance of global supply chains in the ramping up for testing and the development of vaccines and the distribution of those vaccines, and where those gaps and vulnerabilities exist within the global supply chain. In addition, I think COVID has put the spotlight on the highly interdependent nature of our information and communication systems, such that narratives in different parts of the world reverberate almost immediately in other parts of the world. And I think that COVID, you're right, was obviously a global phenomenon, but I think it represents less of a change and more of a manifestation and really an illumination of what has been changing for a while now.
And Marianne, what did you see with respect to the global strategic intelligence function that you lead at Invesco? What was the role that you played with respect to the company's response to the pandemic, and how did it play out?
We found that it's really about just having a team that is responsible for keeping the business informed and being proactive in identifying and communicating threats, potential threats to the business. When I mentioned the global intelligence briefing earlier, that's a perfect example of being able to communicate that awareness. So if you take COVID in early, December 2019, January 2020, having that briefing to be able to communicate to business continuity, global comms, facilities, other parts of technology, other parts of the business that, for example, in the local office in Hong Kong, when they were in early January activating the Hong Kong government, that is, activating their preparedness and response plan, or when Hong Kong and Taiwan decided to increase border screening, all indicating upticks in cases. So just having everybody aware of that same information just helps to be able to better plan and be proactive.
And Chris, from the higher level risk standpoint, what lessons have you seen coming out of the pandemic?
I think risk doesn't exist in isolation, and when you think about it, an enterprise is really an orchestration of activities focused on delivering the firm's strategy, and risk can derail those plans. So I think you have to ask yourself, what are the individual risks or packages of risks that could devastate the organization, and how do you leverage the predictive risk sensing tools, AI, data analytics, scenario planning tools that we have available today, to get an early warning system into changing trends or increasing risk patterns? And then how do you build agility and resiliency into your organization by thinking about how those risks may impact critical functions? And what do I do in order to build contingency plans and resiliency into my operations and systems?
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to my other guests today. On our next episode, we'll be taking a deeper dive into today's threat landscape and looking at how the various types of threats that seem to be multiplying every day are connected with one another, as well as the impact that they have on all types of businesses in virtually every industry around the world. Thank you for listening today, and please join us for our next episode.